On the morning of December 25, 1944, General Major Heinz Kokott stood in his command post near the village of Hemroulle, barely 4 kilometers from the center of the town of Bastogne, and listened to the sounds of his Christmas Day offensive falling apart. Outside, the Ardennes lay under a blanket of snow that had not thawed in a week. The temperature had dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. The pine forests surrounding Bastogne were crusted with ice, and the roads, where they were not blocked by wreckage, were glazed slick. In those conditions, frostbite killed nearly as many soldiers as bullets. Kokott could hear the artillery, not his own. His own guns had been firing since before dawn, softening the American perimeter for what he believed would be the final decisive assault. What he was hearing now was the American response, and it was a sound that made no sense to him. The Americans inside Bastogne had been surrounded for 4 days. 4 days without resupply by road. 4 days cut off from their ammunition depots, their fuel dumps, and their replacement stocks. Kokott had watched the encirclement tighten with his own eyes. He had followed it on the situation maps, watching the blue circle close around the town like a fist. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 26 years in uniform, that a surrounded garrison runs out of ammunition. That is not theory. That is gravity. You burn through what you carry, and when it is gone, the guns stop. Every siege in history confirms it. But the American guns had not stopped. They were firing in dense, concentrated salvos, not the scattered, single-gun harassing fire of an army conserving its last rounds. These were massed battalion concentrations, the kind of coordinated barrage that requires confidence, ammunition, and the full intention to keep fighting. Kokott had fought in Poland in 1939. He had fought in Russia for 3 years, earning the Knight's Cross on March 17, 1943, as an Oberst commanding Grenadier Regiment 337 on the Eastern Front. He had seen what a trapped garrison looks like when its supplies run dry. It looks desperate, it sounds thin. The fire becomes sporadic, scattered, and uncertain. This did not sound uncertain. This sounded like an army that had ammunition to burn. And so Kokott made an inference that seemed, by every measure of military logic, perfectly sound. He concluded that the American artillery was amply supplied. Heavy concentrations equal heavy supply. That was how he reasoned it. He was wrong. At the moment Kokott reached that conclusion, the American artillery inside Bastogne was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Some batteries were down to 9 rounds of high-explosive shells total. The guns he was hearing, the guns that were tearing his Christmas Day attack to pieces. He were being fed 1 shell at a time from a supply so thin that forward observers had been told not to fire unless they could see the enemy forming up. And yet those guns sounded like thunder. If this story reaches you, a like helps it find others who care about the men who held Bastogne. And if you are not subscribed, this is a good time. Kokott was not the only German officer confused by what was happening inside the Bastogne perimeter. Across the entire 47 Panzer Corps front, from the forests north of Foy to the ridgelines south of Marvy, German commanders were reporting the same contradiction. Their intelligence had confirmed the encirclement. Their reconnaissance had observed no significant resupply convoys breaking through. Their own artillery had been pounding the American positions for days, destroying equipment, cratering supply roads, and reducing the town itself to rubble. By every calculation the German staff could make, the American garrison should have been running on fumes. And yet every time a German company formed up for an assault, every time an infantry platoon broke cover to cross an open field, every time a column of tanks moved up a road toward the perimeter, the same thing happened. American artillery found them, not a stray round, not a lucky shot. Concentrated, observed, and accurately directed fire that landed on the exact point where the Germans were most vulnerable, at the exact moment they were most exposed. German prisoners captured during the siege and interrogated at corps level told a consistent story. When asked what had stopped their attacks, they did not name American infantry, though the paratroopers fought with ferocity. They did not name American tanks, though the tank destroyers were devastating. They named the artillery. One after-action report from the 47 Panzer Corps noted that prisoners singled out American artillery fire as the most damaging factor in their inability to press any attack to a successful breach of the defense. The word they used most often was not heavy or continuous. It was accurate. The shells always seemed to land in exactly the right place. Kokott used his own language for what he was seeing. In his post-war manuscript for the United States Army Historical Division, designated MS number B040, titled 26th Volksgrenadier Division in the Ardennes Offensive, he described the American artillery as well directed and sharply concentrated, noting that the enemy fire consistently fell at the decisive points in dense concentrations. And then he added a line that, in its quiet precision, captured the central puzzle of the entire siege. He wrote that the enemy did not spare ammunition. He was describing an army that was, at that very moment, counting every shell. And the fact that he could not tell that the most experienced German general on the Bastogne front mistook rationing for abundance is the key to everything that follows. Because the Americans were not hiding their shortage, they were weaponizing it. But before we can understand how a starving artillery made itself look invincible, we need to understand why Bastogne mattered at all, who was defending it, and why the officer running the defense had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this kind of fight, without ever knowing it. The town of Bastogne sat on a high plateau in the Ardennes forest of southeastern Belgium. It was not a large town, it was not a fortress. What it was, and what made it the most important piece of ground in the entire Battle of the Bulge, was a road hub. 7 paved roads and a railway converged on Bastogne like the spokes of a wheel. In terrain where dense forests, steep valleys, and narrow gorges channeled all movement onto a handful of roads, the army that held Bastogne controlled the traffic in every direction. Without those roads, German supply columns would be forced onto unpaved forest tracks that turned to mud in any thaw and could not support the weight of heavy vehicles. Tanks need fuel. Fuel moves on trucks. Trucks need roads. And the roads went through Bastogne. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47 Panzer Corps, understood this perfectly. At a pre-offensive conference at Kielburg, he had told his subordinates that Bastogne must be captured, if necessary from the rear. Otherwise, he warned, it will be an abscess in the route of advance and tie up too many forces. Luttwitz was right about the strategic importance. He was wrong about the ease of capture. But Luttwitz's superior, General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, saw it differently. Manteuffel wanted his panzer divisions to bypass Bastogne and race for the Meuse River bridges. Speed was everything. The offensive's timetable demanded that German armour reach the Meuse within 48 hours. Spending days reducing a defended town would destroy the schedule. His chief of staff, Brigadier General Karl Wagener, argued that Bastogne would not necessarily have to be taken but merely encircled. The compromise was worse than either pure option. The panzer divisions, 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr, would bypass Bastogne and push west. The task of actually taking the town fell to a single formation, Kokott's 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced by whatever could be scraped together from the Panzer Division's rear elements. This was a fatal miscalculation. It meant that Kokott, a competent and experienced officer, was being asked to capture a critical road junction defended by a fresh airborne division, supported by armour and heavy artillery, with only 1 infantry division and whatever reinforcements trickled in piecemeal. He would be attacking a compact perimeter from the outside, spread thin around its circumference, while the defenders sat inside on interior lines, able to concentrate against each thrust. It was the worst possible geometry for an attacker, and it would be made catastrophically worse by the American artillery. In December of 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was resting in camp at Montmelon-le-Grand in northeastern France. The division had been badly chewed up during Operation Market Garden in Holland 3 months earlier and was still absorbing replacements. Its commanding general, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington. His deputy, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. The division was, for all practical purposes, headless. When the German offensive smashed through the Ardennes on December 16th, the 101st was one of the few reserve divisions available. It was ordered to Bastogne immediately. And the man who took command, the man who would make every critical decision for the next 8 days, was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe was not an infantryman. He was not a paratrooper by training. Anthony McAuliffe was, by career, by instinct, and by 26 years of professional formation, an artilleryman. He had graduated from West Point on November 1st, 1918, in a wartime accelerated class, and was commissioned directly into the field artillery. He had spent the interwar decades rotating through one artillery assignment after another. He had attended the Command and General Staff School in 1937. He had instructed at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the institution that had produced the finest corps of artillery officers in the world. When he was assigned to the 101st Airborne, it was as the division's artillery commander, the officer responsible for coordinating all of the division's guns. Now, by the accident of two senior officers being out of the country at the worst possible moment, McAuliffe was commanding the entire division, and that accident shaped everything that happened at Bastogne. Because when a division is commanded by an infantryman, the infantryman thinks in terms of ground. Hold this ridge, take that crossroads, dig in and hold. When a division is commanded by an artilleryman, the artilleryman thinks in terms of fire. Where are my guns? What can they reach? How do I concentrate every tube I have on the single point where the enemy is weakest? McAuliffe thought in terms of fire. And the fire plan he built at Bastogne, under conditions of near starvation for ammunition, would become one of the most remarkable artillery operations of the entire war. Here is what McAuliffe had to work with, and here is what you need to remember, because this detail changes the meaning of everything you see later. The 101st Airborne did not arrive at Bastogne stripped of artillery. Because the division moved by truck convoy rather than by airdrop, it carried far more ammunition and equipment than a parachute insertion would have allowed. But it was still an airborne division, and its organic artillery was light. Its guns were 75mm pack howitzers, designed to be broken down and dropped by parachute. They were accurate. They were mobile, but they fired a shell roughly one-third the weight of a standard 105mm round. Against dug-in infantry, they were effective. Against tanks, they were marginal. What made Bastogne defensible was not the airborne artillery alone. It was the collection of units that arrived in the town ahead of, alongside, and just behind the 101st. Units that had been retreating through the corridor as the German offensive rolled westward. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, under Colonel William Roberts, arrived before the paratroopers and immediately pushed 3 combined arms teams out to the key road junctions. Team Desabry, under Major William Desabry, held the village of Noville on the northern approach. Team Cherry, under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry, blocked the eastern roads. Team O'Hara, under Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara, covered the southeast. These teams brought medium tanks, armoured infantry, and critically, armoured field artillery, including the 420th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Barry Brown. The fight at Noville showed what these teams could do and gave the first glimpse of how artillery would decide the siege. On December 19th and 20th, Team Desabry, reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade, held the village against the full weight of the 2nd Panzer Division. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned. The fog was so thick that German tanks materialized out of the murk at distances of 50 yards or less, appearing as dark shapes in the white haze before anyone could react. Sherman tanks and Hellcats fired at shadows. German Panther tanks fired at engine sounds. The fighting was point-blank and brutal. Laprade was killed, leading his paratroopers in the defense. Desabry was badly wounded when a German shell struck his command post, sending shrapnel through the room. But the combined defense destroyed at least 30 German tanks and held Noville long enough to convince the 2nd Panzer Division that the village was strongly held by a major force. The German division commander committed reserves he could not afford and lost time he would never recover. When the survivors finally withdrew to Foy on December 20th, they had bought the rest of the perimeter an entire day to dig in, register artillery targets, and wire communications. That day mattered. Without it, the perimeter might not have formed at all. The days between December 20th and the Christmas assault were not quiet. Kokott probed the perimeter repeatedly, testing different sectors, looking for the weak point that would let him crack the defense without a full-scale assault. On December 21st, his Grenadier Regiment 78 attacked toward Bizery from the east. American artillery broke up the assault before it reached the foxholes. On December 22nd, infantry probed toward Marvy in the south. Again, observed artillery fire caught the German troops in the open and scattered them. Each failed probe cost Kokott men and equipment he could not replace. and each probe confirmed the same maddening reality. The American guns were always waiting, always accurate, always concentrated on the exact point of the German effort. By December 23rd, Kokott had concluded that piecemeal attacks would not work. He needed mass, he needed armor, he needed a single overwhelming blow. That decision led directly to Christmas Day. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, arrived on the night of December 19th with May 18 Hellcat tank destroyers, fast, open-turreted vehicles, mounting 76mm guns, capable of killing a Panzer IV at combat range. Templeton distributed his Hellcats in pairs and platoons around the entire perimeter, giving every sector anti-armor capability. 4 of his M18s had fought alongside de Sobry at Noville, destroying German tanks in the fog. Then there were the core artillery units that had been falling back through the area. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit equipped with 155mm howitzers, the heaviest guns inside the perimeter, and survivors of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, another African-American unit that had been overrun in the opening hours of the German offensive, with 11 of its men captured and murdered by Waffen-SS troops near the village of Wereth on December 17th, in one of the war's lesser-known atrocities. Those 11 men, known today as the Wereth 11, were recovered weeks later in late January of 1945, their bodies found in a field, shot and bayoneted after surrendering. The men of the 333rd who made it to Bastogne fought on beside the 969th, with the knowledge of what had been done to their comrades. And there was one more battalion, one that arrived by a decision that no higher headquarters had ordered. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper Jr., was an independent unit originally slated to join the 17th Airborne Division. When the 101st moved out for Bastogne, Cooper volunteered his entire battalion to go with them. He brought his 16 howitzers, 27 trucks, a supply of 75mm ammunition that included more than 200 armor-piercing rounds, and something else that would matter enormously. He brought wool overcoats. In the freezing Ardennes, where temperatures plunged well below zero, that decision saved lives before a single shot was fired. When McAuliffe assembled his artillery on December 20th and looked at what he had, he saw something that most commanders in a surrounded garrison would not have recognized as an advantage. He had guns pointing in every direction, clustered in a tight perimeter roughly 16 kilometers in circumference. The infantry held the outer ring, the artillery sat inside it. And because the perimeter was compact, every gun could fire in a 360-degree arc, reaching any threatened sector within minutes. This is what military doctrine calls interior lines, and it is the oldest advantage in siege warfare. The defender, sitting in the center, can shift forces to any point on the perimeter faster than the attacker, spread around the outside, can concentrate against any single point. McAuliffe understood interior lines instinctively, because that geometry is an artilleryman's geometry. It is the mathematics of fire concentration, and fire concentration was about to become the only thing keeping 15,000 Americans alive. Colonel Thomas Sherburne Jr. took over as division artillery commander in McAuliffe's place. Between them, they organized the guns into a fire direction system that could mass as many as 10 field artillery battalions on a single target. According to a Combat Studies Institute study by Colonel Ralph Mitchell, as many as 10 field artillery battalions could have supported the division at any one time. 10 battalions. A surrounded, cut-off, supposedly doomed garrison had the ability to drop the fire of 10 battalions onto any point on the perimeter where the Germans tried to break through. McAuliffe enforced this centralized control with an iron hand. When one artillery group commander displaced 2 battalions without authorization on December 20th, McAuliffe summarily relieved him. The guns would go where McAuliffe said they would go. The fires would be coordinated through Sherburne's Fire Direction Center. Every round would be controlled. The Fire Direction Center itself was the nerve center of the defense. Sherburne's staff maintained a plotting board that tracked every gun position, every registered target, and every forward observer post. When a call for fire came in, the center calculated which battalions could range the target, assigned them in priority, and transmitted fire commands in seconds. The compact perimeter made this possible. A fire mission called from the north side of the perimeter could be supported by guns positioned on the south side, because the entire defended area was small enough for every battery to reach every edge. In a normal divisional defense, spread over 20 or 30 kilometers of front, concentrating 10 battalions on a single point would require minutes of coordination and complex deconfliction. At Bastogne, the geometry did the work. The perimeter was its own fire direction tool. But there was a problem. The guns could reach every sector. They could mass on any target. They had the observers in place, the fire direction centers wired, the communications functioning. They did not have the ammunition. By December 22nd, the supply situation was critical. Artillery ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. To understand what that means, consider that a single 105mm howitzer, in a normal engagement, might fire 40 to 60 rounds in an hour during a major defensive action. 10 rounds per day meant that each gun could fire, on average, less than 1 round per hour over a 24-hour period. It meant that every shell had to count. Not most shells, every shell. The 463rd's own war record confirms the crisis. It states plainly that shortage of ammunition was critical and restrictions were placed on fire missions. And here is where McAuliffe's artillery training transformed a crisis into a weapon. In a normal defensive operation, artillery performs several functions. It fires harassing and interdiction missions, single guns lobbing shells at road junctions and suspected assembly areas through the night to keep the enemy off balance. It fires preparatory barrages to soften positions before an infantry assault. And when the enemy attacks, it fires defensive concentrations, massed salvos aimed at breaking up the assault. Harassing fire uses a lot of ammunition and produces relatively few casualties because it is spread thin over a wide area. Defensive concentrations use less total ammunition, but produce devastating casualties because every round lands in the same small killing zone. McAuliffe made a decision that was driven by necessity, but was, in its effect, tactically brilliant. He eliminated harassing fire almost entirely. The guns would not waste a single shell on speculative targets. They would fire only when a forward observer could see the enemy massing for an attack, and when they fired, they would fire everything at once. This meant that the American guns were silent most of the time. For hours, the perimeter would be quiet, and German patrols creeping toward the lines would hear nothing. No random shelling. No harassing rounds. Silence. And then, when a German company emerged from a tree line or a column of vehicles appeared on a road, every gun that could reach the target fired simultaneously. The effect was annihilating. Time on target fire missions, where rounds from multiple batteries are timed to arrive at the same instant, produce their casualties in the first seconds of impact, before troops can dive for cover or vehicles can disperse. The first volley is the killing volley. Everything after it hits empty ground. And this is the irony that sits at the heart of this story. The ammunition shortage forced the Americans to fire only in massed concentrations. Concentrated fire is the most lethal form of artillery. And because the guns were silent between salvos, Kokott never heard the thin, sporadic fire of an army running low. He heard only the thunderclaps. And thunderclaps sound like abundance. That is what Kokott meant when he wrote that the enemy did not spare ammunition. He was listening to an army that was sparing every round it had, and because they were sparing them so precisely, he could not tell. On December 22nd, the same day the ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun, a different kind of message arrived at McAuliffe's command post. 4 Germans, 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, approached the American lines south of Bastogne under a white flag. They carried a written ultimatum from General von Luttwitz, commanding the 47 Panzer Corps. The ultimatum demanded the surrender of the Bastogne garrison. It warned that the Americans faced total annihilation by 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions. The threat was specific, and it was blunt. McAuliffe was woken by his acting chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore. He read the message. His first reaction, witnessed by his staff, was a single phrase. He said, "Oh, nuts." When his staff tried to draft a formal reply, his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, pointed out that the general's first response was the best one anyone could write. McAuliffe agreed. The typed reply read, "To the German commander, nuts. The American commander." Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry delivered the message to the waiting German officers. When they asked what it meant, Harper told them it meant, "Go to hell." McAuliffe's aide, Captain Vincent Vicari, later recalled that the word was simply part of the general's normal vocabulary. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was just McAuliffe. The reply became one of the most famous moments of the war. But what is less remembered is what happened to the threat behind the ultimatum. Luttwitz had promised annihilation by massed German artillery. That bombardment never came. The heavy German guns had already been pushed west of Bastogne, beyond range of the town, to support the panzer divisions racing for the Meuse River. Luttwitz had threatened with artillery he did not have. McAuliffe had refused with artillery he barely had, and neither man knew the truth about the other's guns. After the war, General von Manteuffel insisted he had not ordered the ultimatum. It had been Luttwitz's initiative, and its failure only hardened the American resolve. On December 23rd, the weather broke. For 5 days, fog and low cloud had grounded Allied aircraft, sealing the garrison off from aerial resupply. On the morning of the 23rd, the skies cleared to a hard, cold blue. Within hours, Pathfinder teams led by Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch, the chief pathfinder of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, jumped into the perimeter and set up Eureka radar beacons to guide the transport aircraft in. That afternoon, 241 C-47 transport aircraft dropped 144 tons of supplies in 1,446 bundles into a drop zone barely half a mile square. Recovery was estimated at 95%. Ammunition was the number one priority on the resupply manifests. The drops continued on the 24th, the 26th, and the 27th. On December 27th, the final day of major aerial resupply, German anti-aircraft fire brought down 13 C-47s and 17 gliders. The air crews who flew those missions knew the flak corridor they were entering. They flew it anyway. But the resupply did not end the ammunition crisis. It kept the guns alive. It did not make them fat. Every shell was still counted, still allocated, and still fired with the precision of a surgeon who knows the patient has only so much blood left to give. The conditions inside the perimeter were appalling. The ground was frozen so hard that digging a foxhole required hours of chipping with entrenching tools. Many of the paratroopers had left their camp so quickly that they were fighting in whatever they had been wearing, without adequate winter gear, in temperatures that numbed fingers inside gloves and turned feet into blocks of ice inside boots. Trench foot and frostbite were epidemic. Food was almost gone. The paratroopers ate what they could find in abandoned farmhouses, boiled snow for water, and shared K rations that had been intended as a single meal across entire squads. The medics had almost no morphine, almost no plasma, almost no sulfur powder. Wounded men lay in cellars waiting for treatment that in many cases would not come until the siege was lifted. And yet the guns kept firing. The ammunition shortage forced discipline, the cold enforced endurance, and the men who crewed the howitzers, who carried the shells, who cranked the elevation wheels with frozen hands, understood without being told that every round they fired had to matter because there might not be another one behind it. That understanding, shared without a speech or an order from every gun crew to every forward observer, was what turned a handful of shells per gun into a weapon that a German general mistook for abundance. And that discipline, that refusal to waste a single round, was about to face its ultimate test. Because Kokott had been planning his decisive blow, and he had chosen Christmas Day to deliver it, the men who made the rationed ammunition effective were not the generals. They were the forward observers, the lieutenants and sergeants, who sat in foxholes on the perimeter, often within rifle range of the German lines, watching through binoculars for the first sign of movement. The artillery battalions had tripled their observer teams, far beyond what doctrine prescribed. The standard tables of organization provided 3 forward observers per battalion. At Bastogne, battalions deployed 9 to 12, pulling every available officer into observation duties. These men lived with the infantry. They ate what the infantry ate, which by December 23rd was almost nothing. They froze in the same foxholes. They shared the same danger. And when they saw Germans forming up, they called fire missions with a precision born of knowing that there were no shells to waste on a poor adjustment. These observers had been trained in a tradition that the American Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had been refining for 2 decades, a tradition that prized the forward observer as the most important man in the artillery chain, not the gun crew, not the battery commander, the observer. Because the observer is the man who connects the gun to the target, and a gun without an observer is a gun firing blind. At Bastogne, the observers did not just call fire missions, they timed them. They waited, sometimes for agonizing minutes, watching German troops mass in a wood line, watching them form assault columns, watching them begin to move across open ground. They waited until the maximum number of targets were in the open, until the assault formation had committed to its line of advance and could not easily reverse. And then they called for fire. The shells arrived when the Germans were most exposed, most concentrated, and least able to find cover. Kokott's plan for December 25th was the most concentrated German effort of the entire siege. He had been reinforced by elements of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, specifically Kampfgruppe Mocha, a combined arms force under Colonel Wolfgang Mauke, built around the 115th Panzergrenadier Regiment. Mauke brought 18 Panzer IV tanks and infantry, mounted on armoured half-tracks. Kokott combined them with his own 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which, despite a week of fighting, still fielded roughly 17,000 men, with 42 75mm anti-tank guns and 14 Hetzer tank destroyers. The attack would come from the northwest, between the villages of Rationed and Hemroulle, aimed at punching through the perimeter and driving straight into Bastogne. Kokott chose the northwest because he believed it was the weakest point. He had been told by a Belgian civilian in the village of Cibray that the American garrison was falling apart. He reasoned that most American strength had been concentrated to the east and south, where earlier German probes had struck hardest. The historian S.L.A. Marshall, writing the official account, noted flatly that Kokott was all wrong about this. The forces were strongest and freshest in the area he proposed to attack. The northwest sector was held by the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, one of the best-led units in the perimeter. And behind them, positioned near the Rolle Chateau, sat the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, Cooper's guns, the ones that had arrived with 200 armor-piercing rounds. On Christmas Eve, the night before Kokott's planned assault, German aircraft bombed Bastogne itself. The Luftwaffe had been largely absent from the skies over the Ardennes for most of the offensive, grounded by the same fog that had prevented Allied air support. But on the evening of December 24th, German bombers appeared over the town. Incendiary and high-explosive bombs hit the town centre, destroying buildings and striking a medical aid station that had been set up in a building near the main square. At least 21 people, including wounded soldiers and medical personnel, were killed in the bombing. Nurses and medics who had been treating frostbite casualties and shrapnel wounds were themselves buried under rubble. The town burned through the night. The glow of the fires lit the snow-covered fields around the perimeter and cast long shadows through the pine forests. The men in the foxholes watched the town they were defending burn behind them. It was Christmas Eve. Some of them had been singing carols in their holes earlier that evening. Now they watched the orange light flickering against the low clouds and listened to the distant sound of buildings collapsing. In the German lines, Kokott was making his final preparations. He had received Kampfgruppe Mauke only recently and was not satisfied with the force he had been given. He had expected a full division. What he got was a reinforced regiment with 18 tanks and limited infantry. Marshall's official history records that Kokott was shocked at how weak his promised reinforcements actually were. But he had his orders. Bastogne was to be taken. Christmas Day would be the day. The German ground attack began before dawn on December 25th. The artillery preparation was followed by infantry advancing through the darkness across snow-covered fields. The first penetration came on the seam between the 502nd Parachute Infantry and the 327th Glider Infantry, where Mauke's 18 Panzer IVs broke through the thin American line and rolled south toward Hemroulle. At the 463rd's gun positions, Lieutenant Colonel Cooper received reports that tanks had broken through and were approaching from the northwest. He could hear them. In the pre-dawn darkness, the rumble of tank engines grew closer. Cooper made a decision that required either extraordinary nerve or the cold calculation of a man who understood exactly what his guns could do at close range. He ordered his crews to hold fire and wait. The German tanks advanced toward Hemroulle, unaware that they were driving directly into a ring of American guns. Cooper's howitzers, the M18 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion distributed through the sector, and Sherman tanks from Combat Command B were all positioned with fields of fire that converged on the ground the panzers were crossing. When the German column halted within roughly 100 yards of the gun positions, Cooper gave the order to fire. The 463rd opened up over open sights. At that range, even a 75mm pack howitzer firing armor-piercing ammunition can penetrate the hull of a Panzer IV. The 705th Hellcats engaged from the flanks. The infantry of the 502nd, rallied by Chapuis from the Royal Chateau, counterattacked into the German infantry following the tanks. McAuliffe himself later described what happened. He said, "I continued to warn my infantry that the tanks would break through. Well, they did break through, the chief breakthrough coming on Christmas morning, and they got it from all sides. The result was annihilation. All 18 of Moke's Panzer IV tanks were destroyed in the space of a single morning. The Panzer Grenadier infantry, caught in the open without their armor, was cut to pieces by small arms, fire, artillery, and the Hellcats prowling the flanks. By noon, Kokott's grand assault had collapsed into a field of burning vehicles and scattered survivors stumbling back toward the German lines through the snow. For the action at Hemroulle, Cooper received the Silver Star. Sergeant Joseph Rogan, a forward observer with the 463rd who had been directing fire from a position dangerously close to the German advance, also received the Silver Star. 32 men of the battalion received certificates of merit, 29 of them specifically for the Christmas morning fight. The battalion's total casualties for the entire Bastogne campaign were 11 killed, 24 wounded, and 1 missing. On the German side, the casualties were catastrophic. Kokott recorded in his manuscript that the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was practically wiped out. His own 26th Volksgrenadier Division counted more than 800 killed, wounded, and missing in a single day. Grenadier Regiment 77 had barely 300 men left in the line. He noted that a considerable quantity of heavy weapons and equipment had been destroyed and could not be replaced. And then Kokott reached the conclusion that closes the circle of this story. In his battle report, he characterized the Christmas Day offensive as a desperate final effort to force a decision at Bastogne. And he determined that to continue the attack any further would be both irresponsible and unfeasible. The man who had been ordered to take the town, the man who had watched his Christmas offensive evaporate under fire he believed came from an amply supplied enemy, had determined that further assault was futile. Not because he lacked courage. Kokott had earned the Knight's Cross, fighting in Russia. He stopped because the arithmetic no longer worked. He was losing more men to American artillery in a single assault than he could replace in a month. He never learned the truth. He never knew that on the morning of his Christmas attack, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery had started the day with a supply so thin that Cooper's gun crews counted every round by hand. He never knew that the massed concentrations that had torn apart his formations were the product not of abundance, but of discipline, of a system that refused to fire a single unnecessary shell, and instead saved everything for the moment when it would do the most damage. Consider for a moment what would have happened if Kokott had known, if his intelligence had somehow determined that the American artillery was down to single-digit rounds per gun, if he had understood that the silence between the salvos was not confidence but conservation. He might have ordered simultaneous attacks on 3 or 4 sectors at once, overwhelming the fire direction center's ability to shift fires fast enough to stop them all. He might have sent infantry forward in dispersed formations that offered poor targets for massed fire, accepting slower progress in exchange for reducing the artillery's effectiveness. He might have launched a night assault with no warning, denying the forward observers the visibility they needed to time their fire calls. Any of these approaches might have cracked the perimeter. None of them occurred to Kokott because he did not know the perimeter was crackable. He believed he was attacking a well-supplied fortress. He was attacking a house of cards held together by the steadiest hands in the American army. The reason Kokott could not see through this involuntary deception was rooted in something deeper than intelligence failure. It was rooted in how the German army thought about artillery, and more fundamentally, in how the German army thought about scarcity. In the Wehrmacht, artillery was a tool of the plan. The plan came first. An officer designed the attack or the defense. The artillery was allocated to support it, according to a schedule, in prescribed amounts, at predetermined times. Harassing fire, preparatory fire, supporting fire, each had its place in the sequence. Each consumed its allotted ammunition. and each announced to anyone listening the pattern and the resources of the force behind it. This system produced devastating results when resources were adequate. German artillery preparation before an assault was methodical, thorough, and coordinated with infantry movement down to the minute. It was among the best in the world. But the system had a weakness that only appeared under extreme constraint. German artillerymen were superbly trained, and their coordination with infantry had been refined across 5 years of war on multiple fronts. Yet their system assumed a resource flow that moved from the top down. Ammunition was allocated by corps, distributed to divisions, parceled to battalions, and fired according to the fire plan approved by the commanding officer. When ammunition ran short, the German approach was to reduce every category proportionally, like turning down the volume on a radio. Harassing fire shrank, preparatory fire shrank, defensive fire shrank. But the overall pattern stayed the same, and that proportional reduction was audible. An experienced observer listening from outside could hear the fire thinning, could count the intervals growing longer, could sense the garrison weakening. The pattern of decline was predictable because the doctrine of fire distribution was rigid. That was exactly the sound Kokott expected to hear from Bastogne and never did. The American system at Bastogne worked differently, and the difference was not merely tactical, it was philosophical. McAuliffe and Sherburne did not think every category of fire equally. They made a choice that German doctrine would not have supported. They killed entire categories. Harassing fire was eliminated. Not reduced, eliminated. Counter-battery fire was eliminated. Preparatory fire was nearly eliminated. All of the remaining ammunition was concentrated into a single category, observed defensive fire, the one type of mission that produced the highest casualties per shell expended. This was not a decision that could be made by a fire plan, written in advance and handed down from Corps headquarters. It was a decision that had to be made by the artilleryman on the ground, looking at his ammunition count, looking at his forward observer reports, and deciding in real time which missions to cancel and which to amplify. It required a kind of tactical flexibility that the American artillery tradition prized and the German tradition did not. The American Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had spent 2 decades training officers to think about fire, not as a prescribed product of the plan, but as a resource to be managed dynamically, like a surgeon managing blood flow during an operation, sending it where it is needed and cutting it off where it is not. And because every other category of fire had been stripped away, the defensive concentrations were not just maintained at full strength. They were, in effect, amplified, because the guns that would normally have been scattered across 4 or 5 different mission types were now all aimed at one thing, the next German assault. This is why Kokott heard thunder instead of silence. The American artillery was not firing more than it could afford. It was firing everything it could afford in a single place, at a single moment, and then falling silent, and then, when the next target appeared, doing it again. The pattern was invisible from the German side because it looked exactly like what a well-supplied, confident artillery would do if it simply chose to fire only when it mattered most. But the artillery story of Bastogne is not complete without the men whose contribution has been most often overlooked. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion was a segregated unit, African-American soldiers led by both black and white officers, equipped with 155mm howitzers, the heaviest guns in the Bastogne perimeter. Their rounds were far more destructive than anything the airborne 75mm pack howitzers could deliver. When the 101st Airborne organized its defense, the 969th was folded into the fire direction system alongside every other battalion. There was no separate fire plan for the segregated unit. Their shells landed in the same concentrations, on the same targets, timed to the same observer calls as every other battery in the perimeter. When Kokott's infantry formed up in the tree lines south and east of the perimeter, it was often the 969th's 155mm shells that broke them up before they could reach the American foxholes. Those heavier rounds shattered frozen ground into fragments that multiplied the effect of every burst. They collapsed field fortifications. They stopped armored vehicles that shrugged off lighter shells. For their performance at Bastogne, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion received the Distinguished Unit Citation, awarded through 3rd Army by Major General Maxwell Taylor on February 7, 1945. It was among the first such citations awarded to an African-American combat unit in the history of the United States Army. The men of the 969th served under the same rationing, the same cold, the same danger as every other unit inside the perimeter, and they fought with the same discipline that turned a starvation ration of ammunition into a wall the Germans could not breach. On December 26, 1944, in the late afternoon, a Sherman tank, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, crashed through the German lines at the village of Assenois at approximately 4:45 and made contact with the 101st Airborne's outposts. The breakthrough had been brutal. The 37th Tank Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who drove his tanks down a narrow road through Assenois under fire from both sides, refusing to stop, refusing to deploy, and refusing to do anything except push forward until he reached the garrison. Abrams would later become one of the most famous generals in American military history and the namesake of the M1 Abrams main battle tank. But on that December afternoon, he was a tank battalion commander doing the simplest and hardest thing a soldier can do. He was attacking straight into the enemy because the men on the other side of the line needed him to. The first supplies to reach Bastogne by road after the relief were ammunition and medical supplies. The priorities told the story. Ammunition first, because without it the guns would finally fall silent, and if the guns fell silent, the perimeter would collapse regardless of how many tanks Patton pushed through the corridor. The siege of Bastogne was broken, but the fighting around the town continued for weeks. The corridor Abrams had punched through was narrow and under constant German counterattack. It was not until early January that the situation around Bastogne could be called secure. But the breaking of the siege did not change what had already been proven inside the perimeter. The German assault had been stopped, not by Patton's relieving force, but by the garrison itself. And the garrison had been held together, more than any other single factor, by artillery that had no right to be as effective as it was. Over the course of the full Bastogne operation, from December 19th through January 17th, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion alone fired 21,748 rounds from its 16 howitzers. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed approximately 40 German tanks and armoured vehicles during the siege, losing only 6 of its own M18 Hellcats. Eisenhower himself, writing in his memoirs, said the tank destroyers at Bastogne were worth their weight in gold. Kokott survived the war. He was captured by American troops in April of 1945 and spent 2 years in Allied custody. During that time, the United States Army Historical Division invited him to write a detailed account of his operations at Bastogne. S.L.A. Marshall, who conducted the debriefing sessions alongside interrogations of Luttwitz and Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr, described Kokott as a shy, scholarly, and dignified commander who never raises his voice and appears to be temperate in his actions and judgments. In his manuscript, Kokott returned again and again to the American artillery. He described it as the single factor he could not overcome. His account recorded that the attacking infantry suffered heavily under concentrated fire from anti-tank guns, and the wide-angle salvos of enemy mortars. He described the defenders as furious, well-directed, and sharply concentrated in their response, and he repeated the sentence that captures the central irony of the entire siege. He wrote that the enemy did not spare ammunition. He died on May 29, 1976, in Germany. He never learned that the ammunition he believed was unlimited had, on the worst days, been measured in single digits per gun. He never learned that the thunder he heard was the sound of scarcity made lethal by precision. He went to his grave believing he had been beaten by an army that outgunned him. He had been beaten by an army that outsmarted him. Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper, Jr., the man who volunteered the 463rd for Bastogne and then held fire until German tanks were 100 yards from his guns on Christmas morning, survived the war and remained in the army, retiring as a full colonel. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion was inactivated after the war, but its record at Bastogne remains one of the most decorated artillery actions of the entire conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, who commanded the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion and distributed his Hellcats around the perimeter, with the instinct of a man who understood that the next attack could come from any direction, was killed in action on March 1, 1945, when a German 75mm artillery shell scored a direct hit on his position. He did not live to see the war end. Less than 3 months after the siege he helped save. His battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its defense of Bastogne. Anthony McAuliffe went on to command the 103rd Infantry Division and later served as the United States Army commander in Europe. He retired as a full general in 1956 and died on August 11, 1975, at the age of 77. When asked about Bastogne in later years, he did not dwell on his famous one-word reply. He talked about the guns. He talked about fire from all sides. He talked like what he had always been, an artilleryman who understood that when you are surrounded, your guns can reach everywhere. And if you are disciplined enough to fire only when it matters, everywhere is enough. The lesson of Bastogne is not that the Americans had better guns. The Germans had excellent artillery. The lesson is not that the Americans had more ammunition. They had far less. The lesson is about what happens when an army is forced to choose between the kind of fire that sounds impressive and the kind of fire that kills. McAuliffe chose the kind that kills. He chose it because the men directing the fire, the forward observers in their frozen foxholes, knew how to wait for the right moment and then pour everything through that moment, like water through a crack in a dam. The Germans, listening from outside the perimeter, heard concentrated fire and concluded that an army firing with such precision must be overflowing with supply. They were hearing discipline and mistaking it for wealth. They were hearing mastery and mistaking it for mass. That misperception cost Kokott his Christmas Day offensive. It cost the 47 Panzer Corps its timetable. It cost the entire Ardennes counteroffensive the road hub that 5th Panzer Army needed to sustain its drive for the Meuse. Because Bastogne held, the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr, which had bypassed the town, could not be resupplied through the road network they needed. Their fuel ran out, their ammunition thinned. The 2nd Panzer Division's spearhead, which had pushed to within 5 kilometers of the Meuse River near Dinant, was halted on December 24th and then cut off and destroyed in the Chelle's pocket by the British 29th Armoured Brigade and the American 2nd Armoured Division over the following days. The panzers that were supposed to cross the Meuse and drive for Antwerp were reduced to burned-out hulks in the snow, and behind them, the roads they needed ran through a town that a German general could not take because he believed he could not silence the guns inside it. He was wrong about that, too. He might have silenced them, he just did not know it, because the most dangerous artillery is not the kind that fires the most rounds. It is the kind that waits, that watches, that counts every shell, and refuses to spend one until the moment it will do the most damage. The Americans at Bastogne fired like men who could not afford to miss. And because they could not afford to miss, they did not miss. And because they did not miss, a veteran German general who had fought across 2 fronts stared at his shattered divisions on Christmas night and concluded he had been beaten by an army with unlimited ammunition. He was beaten by an army with almost none. Thank you for spending these minutes with the men who held Bastogne. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it reach others who care about what happened in those frozen fields in December of 1944. If you are not yet subscribed, now is a good time, and the bell ensures you never miss one. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor you grew up hearing stories from, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.